Thank you very much, Russ, for joining me here today. You and I have worked in a couple different functions together already at Google, at Looker before that. And we have talked a lot about data analytics and AI and how to mature organizations in it to get the most out of it. And, since you spent the last year or so in the more pure AI space, I would love to hear a bit about, what have you seen for companies to get the most out of it, to mature in it? And how is that different from what you experience in the more data analytics side of the AI space?
Yeah, well, first of all, my pleasure being here. So, really excited to be, one of the first interviews on your podcast. So let me take a step back and tell you a little bit about my adventure in AI. So I had founded a data company with a couple of other friends, and we had started off originally to be a search engine for the data warehouse. So it was called Subset Data. And we, originally targeted connecting to cloud data warehouses and really just cataloging that information. And as a result, we had taken, all kinds of different columns and data points and created a data model and then ingested those inside of Elastic to, participate in a search engine. And we had a product that was about ready to go to market when all of a sudden the GPT-3, hype really just hit fever pitch, right? So think, end of 2022, beginning of 2023, people were enamored with really the magic of a new technology, right? I think that this is one of the first things that feels like a genuinely novel invention of the 21st century. And when we understood a little more about the RAG setup, how to leverage it, how to work with GPT and provide tooling to agents and stuff, we said, hey, you know what, perhaps our product is naturally positioned to be the data provider for something like GPT. And so we were really excitedly doing a lot of product development all throughout 2023 and market testing, doing lots of interviews. And this is really the most informative and my favorite part of the experience was getting to talk to all sorts of different creators in the space and their different experiences interacting with OpenAI, other foundational models, what their end user experiences were. And we were really interviewing them to market test and guide our own product development. What I would say I've seen as trends and shifting from data to AI, it really does feel like a natural fit moving from the cloud data warehouse to the AI space. And I think the reason it feels natural is because it's all part of information science, right? It's really how to use data productively in an organization. And so when you think about your users inside of a company trying to be productive, hey, well, they've got unstructured data, they've got structured data. They use all of these different inputs in any kind of process that they're doing. You're trying to use all of the different data assets that you can bring to bear within your product to really make end user outcomes exceptional. And so they feel like two different things that are instrumental to the same goal. But as yet, it's actually really hard to use structured data in AI. So while they do feel really similar in terms of their form and practice, at the end of the day, it's actually a really big industry challenge right now is how do I use structured information reliably with AI? So happy to speak to some of the challenges of that. But yeah, across the board, really seeing a lot of, people who are coming from a data background, helping fill out a lot of the AI industry.
So before we jump into getting the most out of data analytics and AI, you bring up a really good point of how can we use generative AI for data analytical questions, right? We really early on not that early on, but about a year after the GPT hype came up, they already announced an advanced analytics GPT function. That was one of the first use cases of GPT, of ChatGPT, that was kind of like, here's a persona, here's a created bot that we can use for this use case. And I was also surprised by that, because that's one of the hardest challenge in a probabilistic technology, to be accurate. Like if you think about, right, like GPT, the transformer technology, it's all about like predicting what you want to hear, not what is true. There's a big difference between what I want to hear and what is true, right? So, is that something that you could speak a little bit more about? Like, what have you seen in using generative AI for analytics use cases?
So there was a huge explosion of chatbots that came out, and they were using a pretty conventional RAG setup. And RAG, if any listeners aren't familiar, is retrieval augmented generation. And so the idea is that you go to a data source, and then you're putting all of this stuff into the context window for the LLM, and then the LLM is going to make a much more informed and better guess. So I think the thought process at the time was, okay, well, if we just put enough information in the context window, the LLM will nail it. And there's been a huge amount of challenges with hallucination. What are the right things to put in the context window? If you're thinking about, an analytics question, there's tons of novelty in there. So, like, just to give you a couple of simple examples, would be, okay, your table has a column called state. Well, is it a full state name, or is it the abbreviation code? And if the chatbot gets the SQL wrong, your answer is going to be 100% wrong. Or how do I ask questions about things that are ultimately zero, right? So, like, let's say, for example, your business has no customers in Minnesota. And then, you're like pulling rows to give examples in the context window. And you say, how many customers do we have in Minnesota? It ultimately doesn't give any helpful hints in the context window. And then it would guess the state abbreviation wrong or something like that. And it may not come back with the correct zero entry. So these are like pretty trivial examples, but there's thousands of these kinds of problems all over in the space. And so people have realized, I believe, correctly, that doing analytics with generative AI, you still have to have an expert interpret the artifact that's generated. So there's not, I think, at least at the current time, a way to do, let's say, headless analytics, where a machine can, using generative AI, come to some kind of insight and act on it independently. You probably still want an expert to be reviewing what was produced, and then kind of give their expert sign off before users action it. But the gold standard for SQL generation along these lines is called the Dale benchmark, and so it uses a data set that I think it was. Forgive me. I think it was either the Yale or Stanford computer science departments. They created something called the Spider data set. It's open source. And then Dale tracks a little leaderboard in terms of what is the effective accuracy of generative predictions. And the benchmarks, that leaderboard, it's actually around like 93%, I think, is, at the time we're filming, the highest score, which is really good in some way. But at the same time, what does that 7% inaccuracy mean for your analytical use case? I don't know, right? But it probably means that you need an expert to interpret that. And so I think, broadly, what are we saying is that these things cannot be exclusively relied on, but they can be used to accelerate the existing experts.
Yeah. First off, I love that you're bringing up the combination of data analytics and generative AI, and how that is a very natural extension. Like a year ago, when I started talking about generative AI, a bunch of people in my surrounding were asking, "Oh, are you doing a career shift? I've been data analytics forever, and AI, like." but conventional AI, right? Not generative AI. Generative AI was thought of as text, understanding language, right? Which of course that makes a lot of sense. But I think, that's what you're saying as well here, right? It really bridges the gap to unstructured data that we previously didn't have access to. I do also think it closes that final mile, like you were saying, that analysts in everybody's hands, so to speak. Although I do agree with you that at the current state of where we are with technology, a human in the loop, an expert in the loop, is still very much needed. Since we are not there yet, where the accuracy is always 100%. Like I think you said 93%, right? This is what we're getting right now. In analytics, of course, you have to be 100% correct, right? Like you can never go to a board meeting and announce 93% accurate numbers to your board or, for accounting purposes. So we gotta be there where it really is close to perfect. I know, humans make mistakes all the time as well. So there's never like a completely perfect system, but striving towards that in data analytics at least is, I think, very important. So then what has been your experience in the adoption and maturity out there of companies using AI technologies? I know you and I got to work with hundreds of companies that wanted to be data driven and make data driven decisions, but often struggled to get even anywhere close to the level that a sophisticated company would be at.
Yeah, just one passing thought on the last topic. The fact that there is inaccuracy in the generation, which I think will always be true, that leaderboard is not going to get to 100%. I think we're on asymptotic, slope toward, maybe 99%. That's effectively great, but it can always be wrong. And I think I have this philosophy that I'm kind of realizing, working with a lot of, companies and customers, that really human attention is kind of always needed for, if you're designing some new process, it's really about, hey, well, how do we capstone things with human attention? And human attention is really the scarce commodity inside almost every organization. And so even with that, like 93% accuracy, hey, well, this gives us the tool to operate at tremendously more leverage, but we still need to make sure that, human attention, signs off on work products and outcomes. Really, that blend of attention and, what can we do with generative is just really changing that ratio of like how much time with, eyeballs is needed to actually, produce something. I think that there's a lot of mystical thinking around AI. This is why I even bother saying this, where people envision things being done without human attention. And that I think leads to a lot of let's say maladaptive applications of tech. And I think that can also lead to a lot of internal frustrations as well when people don't understand that it really is fundamentally human in the loop. And I don't see that changing anytime.
Yeah, and accountability, right? I think accountability is a big one where, let's say I want to draft a contract, right, with a customer. Yes, AI can write, it can take the last 100 contracts I wrote and pretty much write a fantastic next contract. But as someone running a business, right, I want to make sure that there's a human who is accountable, right? Because in the end of the day, right, I need someone who signed off, someone I can trust, not just the technology that autonomously made the decision, right? Where the accountability is questionable. I think it's good. Like that's another example where, like, similar doctors, right? Like I would love for my doctor to have Gemini or GPT-4 or whatever version we're going to be on soon, like right next to them, because they haven't been able to read the last 10 papers on the conditions that I'm having, right? Like, but LLMs are very well suited to read the last 10 papers on it. So they can provide additional information to the doctor. But in the end of the day, I want a doctor there, right? I want someone who actually is accountable to the recommendation they're making to me.
Absolutely. And just to add on to that, because I think that's right on. So it's like, both attention and accountability. And I think even just saying attention is almost a proxy for accountability. And I think we need to be careful when we're designing workflows and systems to make sure to not lead people into a false sense of security where they can abandon accountability. Say, like, oh, yeah, no, the machine prediction is probably right. So I think it'd be really wise to anyone who's looking at, okay, well, how do I overhaul, this department with AI to really carefully think about, what are the outcomes we're managing, and then how do we design an accountability system so that people are both accelerated and then don't get lulled into, complacency of just accepting whatever's produced by AI. But anyway, I don't want to avoid your
No. Actually, I love that you're
yeah.
bringing up the topic of
Oh, yeah.
attention there, and then human complacency. Because so I designed a system in 2011, like back in the old days. But this was AI. This was AI already, right? Like we were forecasting or predicting out for this particular. This was for a large large bank. And we're building out this system, or I built out this system to recommend which mortgages someone should qualify for. Right. So in this case, in the mortgage industry, if you're not familiar with it, right, you take a ton of different variables, like a person's age, a person's income, track record of employment, right, all these factors to recommend what kind of risk they represent, credit score, and then what kind of mortgage they qualify for. And it's really just a long if statement. If this happens, or if this condition is true, then that, right? And then within the regulation, they qualify for a certain mortgage. So my system would spin out a recommendation. It was that, right? It was a recommendation. Then an underwriter had to go in and sign off on the recommendation or suggest something else based on what they see. And there was a learning loop back into my system, right? The one concern I had, and exactly to your point now, right? The concern is around, well, are they going to get complacent? Are the underwriters, right? In this case, the underwriters, but any human in the loop, just going to get to the point where, like, okay, I'm on my phone, right? I am just, the system, a super smart system, spins this out and recommends this, and I'm just going to rubber stamp it, right? And I think that is a danger where, the value the human brings is the exact opposite. It's not to rubber stamp, right? And so we as like leaders in companies, right, we have to think about incentive structures. In this case, right, like the incentive was to get as many mortgages out as we can. And so there is absolutely an incentive to rubber stamp it. And as a manager in the next decade here, right, and as a leader in the next decade, I think we have to think about incentives that incentivize our employees to raise the flag and say, hold on a second, I'm holding the assembly line, right? That famous Toyota example of we're pulling the line, all production stops. I'm seeing something here that is not right, right? Like, it doesn't have to be that drastic, but we have to figure out an incentive to encourage raising the flag and saying, okay, I disagree with this, right? I think we should do something else. The AI came up with something that is not accurate or it's not right. And so as managers, we have to think of incentives that doesn't just incentivize faster production, faster output, higher output, but actually focuses on quality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll share an anecdote. This actually is coming from my personal life. I have a 14-year-old nephew who's a prolific online streamer, and he had gotten hacked, was trying to work with a streaming service to get his account restored, and was getting a lot of, kind of arcane responses from the support team and wasn't able to get a resolution. And we really came to the belief that he was interacting with generative AI. I can't be sure, but we were getting a lot of canned responses, and it was pretty clear that they weren't reading between the lines that, hey, this is a minor child who, is the victim of, essentially a cybercrime and is trying to, really like, hey, this really warrants, somebody to come in and pull a lever manually and actually just, hey, send an account recovery code to some third email, right? And that's probably out of process. But when is AI gonna do something like that, or know to do something that's exceptional? And so, are we going to be building a world in which that child is, just completely stuck dealing with robots and then has this, kind of awful Kafkaesque outcome. It was like, no, that's a very dark future. Instead, what we need to do is think about, how are we actually maximizing the output and focusing humans on where their attention and accountability is most valuable, which is actually in, resolving scenarios like that. So, I couldn't agree more.
Interesting. So to come back on the to the intersection of data analytics and AI, especially around like mature organizations, like organizations that are actually successful with it, and the ones that are failing. But I think we can all think of I don't know, our tenure together, we've done hundreds, right? Hundreds of engagements on the data analytics and AI side. You have worked heavily on the more generative AI side. Like, what are some of the themes where you think, okay, this is like, a common recipe for disaster, for failure, and this is a common recipe for success in this scenario? Or is there any overlap between the last 10 and 15 years of data analytics and AI and what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess I'll start on the, some of the success cases, right? So, we were talking a little before about, generative AI and data analytics both being, kind of under the umbrella of information science and how do we productively use it. Well, so probably 8 times out of 10, the people who own the database are ultimately going to be the ones that hold the keys to the information that's going to benefit some kind of organizational outcome, right? And so in the market interviews that we did, going out and talking to, creators and developers and things like that, across, we talked to at least 50 companies or so. And, commonly, they were able to go into the data warehouse, create a relatively simple schema that could then generatively be, exposed to answer simple questions. And that worked well enough and the efficacy was high enough that they were able to, have really successful implementations of an assistant chatbot that used structured information. So one example that I'm thinking about was accounting software. For it was a B2B product. Hey, well, I need to be able to answer simple questions about transactions against my ledger that I own that are a little unusual. Hey, in the last 90-day rolling period, have there been any, 2 sigma or 3 sigma large transactions and stuff? And using, some different roll-up tables and then some simple, anonymization procedures, they were able to build that functionality really quickly against OpenAI. That's wonderful. And so that's a pattern that I think, lots of people are trying to replicate to, varying degrees of success, but that's like a kind of an archetypal success case. Hey, we have very useful information that we can introduce, into our product. The cases for generative AI that really fall outside of data are ones where you're taking data from your customer, and so there's really no involvement of the data warehouse and things. So, for example, let's say you have an application that has just a lot of, forward fill. I need to, put in 9 different demographic filters to get what I'm looking for. And what I've seen from a number of different companies is that they're having, generative AI predict the JSON that would be the next best form fills. So hey, well, I select, millennial female that lives in the Midwest or whatever, and then it's able to predict, maybe 3 other demographic factors, produce a JSON that can then be sent to the front end and then fill in that form, and it creates a more elegant UX. And it's just, enhancing the, the end user. They're just spending less time with, clunky UXs and stuff like that. So that's like low hanging fruit in a lot of product companies. And then the data people just, on average, don't need to be involved with those sorts of small product enhancements. Those tend to be just developers that are working on those sorts of things. And then one other kind of pattern that I've seen talking to a lot of companies is a real big disconnect. So I moved from the optimistic to the pessimistic, and so this is really something for all of our listeners to look out for. Talk to an organization where their core product really came from a traditional ML space, traditional data science, and it provided, predictions. Then their customers could download and use in their workflows and things. The senior management, which is non-technical, became very, very bullish about what generative AI was going to be able to do for their business, but they did not really get into the technical details of how that would happen. And instead, they just really put out a lot of pressure and put out a mandate, for all the, technical product managers and developers, like, hey, we need some Gen AI ASAP. And this was really, I was talking to these companies like right after the kind of like the peak of 2023 buzz, around generative. And so let's just say less than technical executives demanding that things be branded as Gen AI when that may or may not be applicable to really producing the outcomes they want. So what ended up happening, we talked to some of those technical product people, and they were so jaded that they were leaving, and they were leaving in droves because the tech stack is really, fundamentally different. Working with generative AI versus the traditional, ML tools that they were working with, before just didn't match up, and they didn't really know how to satisfy the executives. And frankly, the executives didn't really know what they wanted. So I think the cautionary tale, just to make it a bumper sticker, would be, don't buy into like just the hype. Engineer processes where your people are getting more leverage and take that seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the success criteria that I saw in becoming a more data-driven company, a more using data to make decisions that worked really well is if you do both a bottoms-up and a top-down initiative, like not just okay, the CEO got super excited, now they're on a dashboard all the time and talking about the KPIs, but also there's a few people, on the ground, so to speak, that buy into it, and mid-level management is starting to use in team meetings, like showing how they use data to make decisions. And if you have that, right, if you have it not just top down, but also bottoms up, then it really works. Where like I've seen it many, many times, right, where bottom up, right, the marketing associate, like they are nervous about spending all these marketing dollars. They want to have data to support their decision making. So they advocate for it, but maybe top down, right? They're more of the, I call it the golf and guts. My accent might not be well suited for this, but golf and guts being, like I'm on the golf course, I'm hitting a couple balls, I had my scotch, and now I'm going to make a decision, right? Those people that they don't necessarily want to use data, right? So there needs to be a little bit look in the mirror where like, okay, do we really, like, are we just doing this because the cover of The Economist told me I should be a data-driven company, or are we doing this because I truly believe in it, right? I think there needs to be, from a leadership perspective, a little bit of a self-realization moment there. And then, if you have both top down and bottom up, then I think it is successful. And I think that's the same for generative AI. Right now, a lot of CEOs out there are reading the cover of The Economist again, right? Or whatever magazine they like to read. And they think they need to be a Gen AI company or AI first company or have an AI strategy, right? I talked to some senior people in private, and they told me, like, my board tells me I need to be an AI company. We have nothing to do in our business with AI. I have no clue what to say. So I guess we're signing up for like a ChatGPT subscription now, and that's our AI strategy. And that's it, right? Like, that's not a strategy to be successful.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. The bottoms up, though, I think is extraordinarily valuable. Yeah, so I think we're you're kind of saying let's say a blanket or inappropriate top-down strategy can be killer. Like I had seen at the company, they were creating all this attrition for themselves, through these kind of like ignorant ivory tower mandates to use Gen AI. But I do think that the organic bottoms up is really a beautiful thing, and that's where a lot of people are actually seeing the sweet spot. Because perhaps there is no applicable use case for Gen AI in your product, and there's not like top down initiatives to manage, but simply turning on maybe an open AI subscription and giving everybody enterprise chat GPT. You make sure that the security boxes are checked, and then you just encourage people to use it in their daily workflows. And I know I've seen that, personally, anecdotes from, everybody I know is using, chat GPT in their job in some form or another. And seeing tremendous like productivity as a result. And nobody knows their own workflow better than the employees themselves. So I think the bottoms up, like just destigmatizing the use of chat GPT, or other similar things in your workflow, I think can allow people to be more innovative, and really tons of hypotheses, better ideas than you can generate top down start to come from the bottom up. So I think that there's there's something really valuable that companies can do just by challenging their employees to use these things as they see fit, but not forcing things top down when it might not be applicable.
Yeah, I think destigmatizing is a really good really good term there. I know a bunch of companies are banning it flat out, right? Like, which really, I think a lot of innovation comes from just, start using it, see what happens, see if it works for this well or that, right? Like you never know where the innovation actually will come from and the efficiency gains will come from. So I think from a top-down initiative to say, we'll do it, you give it a try, right? And maybe once a quarter we do an innovation award of someone who came up with a cool way to use these new features, and even put something behind it. So you really do encourage people to use it and see where it might be really useful to use. On the front of like learnings from more mature use cases versus like companies that maybe failed, right? Like, do you have any other parallels between your experience from the data analytics side to what you have been experiencing now?
Yeah. So one more generative use case organization that I talked to, and I was left. I mean, this really dropped my jaw, seeing how productively they use generative AI. So, without getting into too many specifics about the company, because I, definitely want to respect their anonymity, they have a cloud code product that allows, all sorts of, different, coding types. And so they're managing, many different languages and input formats and all these different things, and supporting developers as users. And they're able to use Gen AI in a way that is, not dissimilar from GitHub Copilot, if you're familiar. Now, there is a tremendous amount of training data that is required to support that many different languages and framework types and all of the different things that could be, going on inside of their platform at any given time. They use Gen AI to generate the training data to generate the experience that, and I was really blown away because, when I was, interviewing members of their team, they said, well, we actually assume that Gen AI will be an instrumental part of everything that we do, and you'd actually have to argue otherwise. And so they're, really, they almost have this self-reinforcing loop where they're using Gen AI to better the Gen AI in their product. And there was something else. Oh, yes. And they also introduced me to a method that, maybe some of the listeners will already be familiar with. But some of their efficacy testing criteria uses a methodology called self-critique, which is where you have generative AI grade whether or not the generative AI is working. And so the entire experience, of working with and understanding these folks' use case was very meta, because they were using, Gen AI to both, generate training data, ascertain its effectiveness, and and grade all those things, and then ultimately to produce a better Gen AI experience inside their product. And so I was really almost looking at them as like a lighthouse of what Gen AI can do when people have the aptitude and the the design principles baked into their thinking and their daily activities, right? So like they know, hey, I probably am going to get more leverage as a developer, as a PM, as an employee in doing what I do if I'm using Gen AI in some meaningful way in this process. And so I'm gonna generate my unit tests using our foundational models. And hey, why don't I create a matrix of all these different things that I need a foundational model trained on, and then I can generate that training data as well. And so they've got a very lean staff, and they're extremely successful.
Interesting. Yeah, I was wondering, I mean, related to that, in the evolution of using data to derive insights for your company, we have seen the role of the chief data officer, right? Like the director of analytics. There were so many different titles, but I think the chief data officer has been around now for a few years. Do you see something similar for AI specifically, right? Like initially, it always starts off as it's a CTO's job, right? It's like, it's someone's side job in essence. Do you think there will be something similar, or do you think it just becomes really, really core to the CTO's job?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I do think it's confronting a lot of CTOs now, and a lot of CTOs are feeling that pressure, and they are better positioned to facilitate the organization's adoption than almost anyone else, flat out. If you've got a executive team, then yeah, almost definitely the CTO is probably going to be in the driver's seat of that. Is it distinct enough that it requires a separate role in the future? I don't actually think so. And, for the reasons going back earlier in our conversation, ultimately, these are mostly leveraging things that are already very well known in the business. In terms of the data, whether it's unstructured, structured, these are already things that are owned and under the, CTO's purview. They know the InfoSec policies on the different assets that they manage and maintain. They're the ones that own the LDAP or the SSO system. They're the ones that hold the keys, and their respective teams own the keys to all of these information assets that we want to hoist up into AI. Who is going to better understand that than the CTO? I think what a lot of CTOs are potentially feeling anxiety around is if their background, they haven't involved themselves with, generative AI. And so, perhaps they came up in a data background, or, hey, I'm a .NET programmer by trade, and then I got promoted into management. I have now no idea what to do with AI. Right. And so, but you know what, frankly, everyone's learning. Nobody is a true expert yet. And that's one of the things that's simultaneously overwhelming and exhilarating about AI, is that everybody is learning and experimenting and, trying to work that in. And so I think that the CTO role is probably the person that should be, doing the self-reflection and kind of like picking up the mantle to, drive AI at at their companies. And then over time, subdivisions in labor and new roles, they may, introduce, people under them and like distinct job functions that drive adoption in like really targeted or specific ways or bring on new skills to the business. But I do think that the CTO role can manage it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's especially true for technology companies, right? Like any technology out there needs to make, generative AI a big part probably of their product in some way. Um, when we then look at like a retail company, right, or a financial services firm, for example, I could see it where similar to the data analytics, data insights evolution, there's some sort of center of excellence, right, in that space that then supports different function. I could envision, in the retail space, for example, that customer support, right, is going to be heavily Gen AI supported in the future, and so you probably want to have some sort of function that manages that product almost internally, right? What is the best RAG methodology? What is the best way to token like chunk our existing documentation, right? So it's very accessible to our Gen AI product. Like all these different things. Maybe it will be still under the CTO. Maybe there will be some sort of hub and spoke model as well. That probably depends a bit on how big the organization is, what kind of industry the organization is in. I do think you're right. Like every CTO needs to definitely educate themselves very well on this, as it is quite a core tool to have in your tool chest going forward.
Certainly.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for joining me here today. I know we've been chatting for a while, and I think that we covered a lot of good topics there along the way. So yeah, thanks for jumping on.
My pleasure. Anytime, Lucas.